Okay, well, we're going to start because that's the way it should be. All right, so first of all, good afternoon or good morning, depending on who you are and where you are, but to me at least, good afternoon. The topic of integration or not of tradition and academic Bible study is one that's very near and dear to my heart, actually. It's something that originally, I'm a diehard traditionalist in the fullest sense, but I realize very easily anybody with who reads anything knows that academic Bible study has a lot to offer. And that's something which is really very important, and all learning is good. And it certainly helps just from the precedent of our classical commentators drew from in those days, there's no such word as Orthodox, of course, but from non-traditional Jewish rabbinic scholarship, whether Karaites or Christians, occasionally even Muslims if they had access. And they certainly, there was a lot of cross-pollination. And the fact that our classical commentaries did that means that this was always relevant. Academic study is a little different in the sense that it purports to be more neutral. And which Christian scholarship, at least religious Christian scholarship, believes, depending on the denomination, in a certain religious slant on how to interpret the text. Same with Jewish, same with Karaite. So that all said, academic is supposed to be a little different from all of that. And hypothetically, we should all be able to sit down from all faith communities and all people who don't believe in anything and everything in between. And learning is learning and scholarship is scholarship. So it was in 2016, I've been teaching at Issue of University since 1996, that a bunch of students approached me begging me to teach a course in the whole interface, just because they read stuff online or in books and it's all out there. And there was simply no guidance. Issue of University had nothing that really addressed, in a full throttle way, the whole interaction. So I thought that was a great idea. And of course, that would also force me to prepare the course, which is, I love that. And so I had to go to the administration and try to sell the idea. And they were very open to it, actually, because they were aware of the fact that this was a live issue. They didn't pretend that, oh, come on, who reads this? What's the concern? They understood that it was a concern without knowing what the issues were. And they thought I'd be a good guy to do it. So I proposed teaching a course, calling it Traditional and Academic Methods of Bible Study, or something, to say what it is. So they didn't like that because that would be too open. So they changed it to Sugyot and Parshanut in Tanakh. Sugyot are just topics, and Parshanut is interpretation in Bible study, which is about the most general possible sounding thing, other than at least it includes the word Bible study somewhere in there. But so basically, I tried to explain, if I were in yeshiva college, I would have loved to have had a course like that. But if I saw a thing called Sugyot and Parshanut in Tanakh, I wouldn't necessarily register for that because that's just very general. But all the same, it's a small place, so word does get around. So a book that I found is a useful springboard for a one-off discussion. And again, feel free to chime in at any point with particular issues, and I'll try to end earlier than too, so that way there's a little more time for give and take also. One of the first books that became popular in the sense of it was written for a popular audience was James Kugel's How to Read the Bible. He came out with it in 2007. It was bad for me because I was still a synagogue rabbi at the time, and it was right around the high holiday season, which is a fairly busy point in the rabbi's schedule. And then this book came out. Now, I can't say that any of my congregants read the book, but many of them had read the New York Times book review, which is the worst of everything, because the person who wrote the review was very clear, never read the book. But you can get away with that stuff in the Times, and in most book review things. And so he got away with it. And so my congregants had read that, and now we're suddenly perplexed and befuddled and all of that. Okay, so over the years, I found that was a good starting springboard, just for where the issues are, and then just going through several points. Then I'll turn it over to you if you have, let's turn it into more of a discussion. So in the good old days, Jews, Karaites, and Christians all believed that God revealed the Torah to Moses at Sinai, and at least through the desert experience, or at least nearly all of the Torah. There might have been a few later glosses here and there. There certainly were people who thought that, but by and large, that was the one thing we agreed upon. After that, it got a little more complicated. Okay, we had our Jewish theology with the oral law and rabbinic teaching. Christians had their church traditions. Karaites pretended that they had no traditions other than the Bible. That was not true. They certainly had an oral law also, just not ours, not the rabbinic one. But they certainly had to interpret. There is no way to make a legal system based entirely on the written law of the Torah. There simply is no way. And whether they admitted that or not, that was certainly true. And that was that. But at least we could all agree on that. So when we had our polemics, we at least had that ground rule in order. Okay. Well, thanks to Spinoza, Spinoza really was the game changer in this, Hobbes also, but really Spinoza is the one who I think gained greater notoriety / fame, and who denied that God revealed the Torah to Moses. He thought that the Torah was written in a much later period, in the beginning of the Persian period, many centuries after Moshe. And he basically viewed it more as a political document. So at the beginning, okay, so he was a heretic. People ignored him. Jews ignored him. The church ignored him even more. But down the road, it began to pick up, particularly in liberal Protestant circles, and specifically in Germany originally, and then it spread. The reason why Protestants liked that sort of approach the most out of all the different faith communities is very simple. They at least have this idea of sola scriptura, that our whole doctrine should come from within the text of the Tanakh itself, the Bible itself, whereas Jews have their traditions, Catholics have their traditions, Protestants had theirs too, but they had a much easier time making that adjustment. So they started doing that. And at first, it might have been a very noble religious pursuit, but it didn't take long for them to start denying the most basic axioms of faith, regardless of what faith community you come from. So when I read Kogel's book, it was all the way on page 516. I remember reading that page and saying, this is really what he's trying to say for the whole book. And just make a note, it's like a 700 and something page book. But page 516, he's talking about the Song of Songs. And he just imagined that in the Song of Songs, okay, so if you read it, it's a love poem. A man and a woman are madly in love with one another. They describe each other very physically. They love each other very, very much. They pursue one another. It's a beautiful poem. So tradition, both Jews and Christians were pretty unanimous, not 100%, but very close, that there's some allegory. So Kogel presumes that that allegory was a later imposition by rabbis / priests, and that the original meaning was a love poem. So he gives the analogy there about she'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. So imagine some people just having a kumsitz Friday night, they're singing, they're drinking, whatever they're doing, and then they sing that song, she'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. And somebody just for fun says, well, why is she riding 6 white horses? And somebody else says, oh, there's a symbol here, it must refer to the Messiah and this and that. And wink, wink, they all know that they were having a good time. But alas, some of their kids overheard the conversation and they thought the parents meant it. So they passed it on and they passed it on. And before you know it, that became what the song means. But of course, it's not what the song means. The song is just about she'll be going around the mountain when she comes. There's no deeper allegorical or religious significance to it. So he basically uses that as the model for what the academic model is, that originally the Bible had no sanctity, it had no real meaning the way that all faith communities, and to be perfectly honest, thoroughly secular people also, people who read the Bible find meaning in it. So that meaning, according to Kogel, all was a much later addition to the whole story. Obviously, you could debate what the meaning is, but that there is meaning is a later assumption. Okay, so in a nutshell, I thoroughly disagree with that conclusion, and I'm friends with Professor Kogel. I had a long email exchange with him afterwards. Back in my going to Israel to visit days, we used to get together for tea and hummus every single time, and we would sit down and chat. And plus, he's just a serious mensch. Besides being a truly towering scholar, he's a really fun person to hang out with. But in this particular issue, I have a hard time grasping his central thesis. And I think it's just a good springboard. What my whole approach is, you can't prove faith. That's not a scientifically provable thing. You have it or you don't, and obviously it's a process for most of us. It's not so black and white, whatever that level of faith is and however we come to it. That's a very personal journey, which can have ups and downs, and that's perfectly normal and fine. You can't scientifically prove faith, and I'm glad we live in an age where we don't think that we have to. The point of the whole course that I give, that I mentioned before, or any smaller talks, has to do with the fact that scholarship never refutes faith either. In other words, you don't have to choose between faith and science in the realm of Bible. You don't have to choose between faith and science in the realm of empirical sciences either, but certainly not in the case of Bible. So here are just a few buckets, and then again, I'll turn it over to you, because I'm sure there might be very particular things. And feel free to jump in before the end also. One thing is called an ideological myth. The idea of an ideological myth, I know, and my sister Rhonda is on the line also. Rhonda, you remember Captain Kangaroo Just So stories? So we spent a lot of time listening to these old records with Captain Kangaroo. That was a very important children's show when we were kids. And so we had a Just So stories record. Yeah, there you go. So it was a wonderful thing. We used to sing it. We even had Teaser of the Monkey with a puppet, I seem to recall. In the meantime, it turns out that this was all from Rudyard Kipling, but how was I supposed to know this? I was 5 or however little we were. So it goes back to just so stories. And the idea is, how did the elephant get its trunk? Okay, so the elephant used to have a nose the size like a boot, and he was taking a drink in the water. The crocodile got him by the nose and pulled and pulled and pulled. And after a bunch of tug of war, he ended up with a trunk. And then Teaser the Monkey teased him. So that's that Captain Kangaroo rendition of how the elephant got its trunk. Okay, so in the 19th century, it was the German scholar Hermann Gunkel. My terribly American pronunciations of all these German names, but that's okay. He's the one who really went for it in 19th century Germany about the ideological myths, and he claimed that much of the Bible are basically ideological myths. The idea is these are later stories that were invented out of whole cloth to justify current reality. That's what an ideological myth is. So if an elephant has a trunk, so you make up some story about, well, how did that ever happen? Can't be God created him that way, no way. It has to be that something happened, but you're making that something up. So the truth is, Tanakh does have several examples which clearly have that ideological nature. Again, the word myth in real life, it doesn't mean false, right? And in the true sense, it simply means a foundational story of a culture that helps shape its identity. So the Exodus from Egypt is one of our myths. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It simply means that is a basic Jewish foundational narrative that shapes our very identity in every sense. So there certainly are stories that are explicit as to why certain realities now came about, why there are so many different languages. Okay, Tower of Babel. Why Jews can't eat sirloin steaks without removing the so-called sciatic nerve. Okay, because Jacob had a wrestling match with an angel. There definitely are stories where explicitly there's a practice or a reality in the world, and Tanakh tells you this is why something happens. So it's certainly on our books. It's not a foreign concept to the Bible. The question is, should you extend this to everything in the Bible, even if it doesn't explicitly say this? For example, the story of Cain and Abel. Okay, so I think that there's a lot of good moral teaching that could be had, and I'm hardly alone here. For thousands of years, Jews, Christians, Karaites, and total non-believers, and everyone in between, understand that there are very profound elements of jealousy, religious strife, the idea of murder, sibling responsibility. There are so many basic lessons that emerge without having to give any in-depth analysis of anything, okay? Well, all of a sudden, the ideological myth camp started saying, no, the people of Israel made up this story to teach about a certain violent group in their day called the Cainites. And as there was no deeper meaning, these stories weren't meant to be studied so that we could really delve into the world's first murder and its root causes, and how can we learn to be better than that, and all of these things that I think people very intuitively look for. They will say, or Kugel says, that type of reading did not happen until the Hellenistic period. Until then, it was simply an ideological myth explaining why the Cainites are so violent, because they come from this made-up fictional character called Cain. Okay, so Kugel says, what do we do now that we know this? How do we read the Bible now that we know this? So I asked him, what do you mean no? It's a theory by a very important scholar. Hermann Gunkel is not a lightweight. He was incredibly knowledgeable and very smart man. But the fact that he posits that the story is this isn't knowledge. It's a theory. It's a way of reading the story. It doesn't match what any traditionalist or anybody, a human being reading the story, intuitively feels is right. But that isn't a no issue. That is a think. And he's allowed to think that. I'm not going to try to take away that layer of possible interpretation from the story, given that the Torah certainly has stories that involve that. Another example. I like to think, silly me, that chapters 1 through 3 of the book of Bereshit or Genesis, you have the creation, you have the Garden of Eden. You can learn so many lessons from that. It's crazy. And boy, oh boy, do we. Jews have our way of doing it. Christians have their way of doing it. There's so many different ways within each faith tradition. That's fine. So the ideological myth way of reading the story is that it's the priestly promotion of the Shabbat, of the Sabbath day, and the discovery of agriculture and the resulting change in societal organization, the end. There never was any deeper meaning or any religious issue to grapple with. It's only in the Hellenistic period when Jews started saying the whole book was God's word, and it has meaning, and has lessons for us. Those were all 3rd century, 2nd century BCE ideas. And until then, there were just stories that taught us about the origins of agriculture. Okay, Adam and Eve, let's make up a story about Adam and Eve sinning, and they were kicked out, and now we have to work really, really hard plowing the field. And other things that come out, why snakes don't have legs. Okay, so it gives you that sort of just so story. So Kugel starts asking, well, if this is what the modern Bible scholarship says, then why learn the Bible at all? And I agree, unless you are a student of ancient mythologies, there's no value anymore. If that's what you think the original meaning of the Bible is, what do you get out of that? You could ask very simply, first of all, just intuitively, it's hard not to notice that people of any belief or not can really plunge into a story like this and find it meaningful. We'll disagree over what the meanings are, and that's the way it should be. We Jews can't agree on anything, and even the most knowledgeable Jews in our history could never agree. I remember once I had a summer internship when I was in college on Park Avenue, and I would bring a chumash to read during lunch hour. So my chumash, like any good Jewish chumash, had commentaries all over the page. So I had a friend who was a very devout Lutheran, smoked way too much, but other than that, he was my favorite person in the office by far. And he asked me what I was reading. So I explained to him, I said, okay, these big letters over here, this is the text of the Bible. And all these other things around here are various rabbis, some of the most prominent ever. And right now, this one is seriously having an argument with that one. And he's like, wait, these things are on the page of your Bible? Well, I just have a Bible with the text. We have commentaries, but they're in separate books. I said, nah, the joy of it is going through these debates, and it's all legitimately part of our tradition. And he thought that that was just super duper cool. But you have to at least ask, if the Bible originally was just a bunch of ideological myths trying to explain the realities of something, why would the entire Jewish people change that assumption and turn it into the Bible as we know it? Why elevate fables that have no meaning to infinite meaning? That's just a question. That doesn't disprove anything. It's just a weird situation. So to me, at least, what you have here is not faith versus science. This whole category is one method of reading a text versus another method of reading the text. But it's not that you could prove one over the other. I can't prove a traditional Jewish way or any traditional way of reading a text. That's not a scientific argument. So the person who was really frustrated by this is somebody whose career was seriously hampered. You would never think that her career was so hampered, but it was. Nechama Leibowitz, who was easily the greatest Tanakh scholar of the previous generation, who had such a profound impact on Bible study, both in religious circles and in academic circles. She really had a gift like nobody else. But she taught at Tel Aviv University for a while, and they would not give her a position in the Bible department. Why? Because she believed in the religious axioms of God revealed the Torah. They say, sorry, that's not our way. So they put her in the education department, so she was able to have an impact, but she was deeply offended. And her response was, at least I know that I'm biased. But you guys pretend that you're science, which I think is a fabulous comeback and exactly right. So that was my back and forth with Professor Kugel on this. It's like, I'm not pretending that I have the truth. I believe that the Jewish traditional way of reading is a true path. And within that, there's such a multiplicity of readings, nobody can know what the right one is. But that's very different from saying it's faith versus science. Okay, so that's one category. Another category that comes up is just the fact that there are certainly parallels in earlier laws and earlier stories. There's a flood narrative in every culture. Creation stories, of course, are everywhere. And there are laws, including some that are strikingly similar both in law and in formulation to those in the Torah. So it's really interesting. It was actually a three-pronged process. For whatever reason, Professor Kugel stops at the second one. The three-pronged process is that in the first wave of so-called biblical archaeology, the main archaeologists were actually Bible-believing Christians. And they set out to prove the Bible. So sure enough, when that's your agenda, funny enough, things work. You find things that corroborate exactly what you're saying, shed light on what you're saying. It's terrible scholarship because you're coming in with a preconceived notion. Even if I might be sympathetic to their worldview in that way, it doesn't matter. That's not scholarship. Okay, that was wave one. Wave two was the counter-revolution. No, the fact that there are so many similarities between A and B doesn't prove anything. It just shows that the Bible is a cheap knockoff of these ancient myths and laws. That the Torah is simply drawn out of that world. So that was phase two. But there's a third phase that started in the 1950s and 60s. It's been around for a while. It's not a newfangled thing. So we can be Monday morning quarterbacks, which is, okay, yes, there are indeed many parallels and at least analogies between the Torah and earlier and much more ancient cultures than ours. But the Torah was a radical revolution in terms of theology, in terms of law, in terms of values, in terms of everything. So much so that it's patently clear that it did not simply grow out of these. You would have to be Yechezkel Koifman, who was the professor, the head of the Bible department at the Hebrew University in the middle of the 20th century. He kept it neutral. He said whoever wrote the Torah was an utter genius, so much so that he was able to transcend the entire world. So he wouldn't say that therefore it's God, because you can't scientifically prove that. He said either it's God or it's just the greatest human genius ever in the realm of theology, because there simply are no analogies in content between. It didn't just naturally evolve from other cultures that were out there. It's such a radical break, and so on. So I asked Professor Gunkel about this also. I said, again, it's not to prove A or B. It's simply to say, granted that there's been very firm scholarship coming from people who don't believe in the divine origin of the Torah, who can just demonstrate, look, here are the values of the laws of Hammurabi, here are the values of the Middle Assyrian laws or the Hittite laws, whomever, and here are the values of the Torah. And you see consistent trends. Doesn't that count for something? To at least say it's not just a knockoff. Same thing with the flood narrative. Okay, everybody had a flood, but what values is each source trying to teach? And the answer is radically different ones. Each one of these lines is a shiur in its own right, and I like giving all of them. But for now, it's just a summary. So he just says, that's all apologetic. I don't understand how one can say that this is all apologetic. Again, you can't prove A or B, but you can just see the trends. You can see the values. You can see the laws and the radical differences between the Torah and everything that was out there. So it's hard to say that it simply was a knockoff from that. That's another zone of inquiry that has caused many people to scratch their heads and say, oh no, academic scholarship threatens faith. I, for the life of me, don't, if anything, that would just demonstrate, like, thank God we have the Torah, which made such a vast improvement in the world and set out a vision that goes ahead. A third zone is the challenge of historicity. Did it happen? So here the problem is that, it's not a problem. Judaism is not Protestant fundamentalism. And we've had some of our greatest lights always take for granted that the Torah never can contradict anything that is empirically provable. So usually that shows up, these principles show up in the realm of what we call empirical science. But even if we could somehow prove a different historical reality here or there, or what happens more likely is there's not enough archaeological evidence to demonstrate A or B, which is hardly a proof of anything. Tanakh isn't a history book, right? It's just important, leaving alone the faith challenges that the Academy may pose. The reality is that Tanakh never was a history book. It has historical events in there, but it's a prophetic work, or a series of prophetic works, designed to teach all about the relationship of God and his people Israel and all of humanity. It's far beyond Israel, from the very beginning and all the way through. You have a British scholar, his name is Kenneth Kitchen, who I like very much. He was a very prominent Orientalist who has a great British sense of humor, which he feels free to share in the pages of an otherwise very serious book. So I like that, because it's otherwise kind of dry, but he's very funny. It's called On the Reliability of the Old Testament. By Kenneth Kitchen. He just gives several examples which don't prove, again, nothing proves faith. It's more just about issues to think about. Very often people look at the Torah as a theology rather than a history, because it mentions God an awful lot, which it does. Kitchen just says that every ancient group mentioned their gods in their writings, because that's what you did. At least nominally, and sometimes quite sincerely, they were very religious people and did not see the world in secular terms. So just as archaeologists might read Assyrian documents that are constantly crediting Ashur and other gods of theirs for all events, we would still say there's some historical stuff in there, even if we don't have to assume that it's 100% accurate. Give Tanakh at least that respect, rather than saying, since there's so much religion, therefore it cannot be viewed as a history at all. He mentions a very important point that yeshiva day school students have to disabuse themselves of anyway. I have to spend a lot of time disabusing my students at yeshiva university every time. on this issue. I was taught, following certain midrashic traditions, that the patriarchs and matriarchs observed the entire Torah, I mean, all of the laws that we now know from Moses and onward. Okay, there are plenty of rabbinic views that disagree, but somehow we were not taught any of those ever. So it took a while to come across them, and then I'm like, wow, this is a pretty widespread view. What matters is that if these are ideological myths written by Jews living at or Israelites living in a much later period who are already observing the laws, they would, of course, cast the patriarchs and matriarchs as observing our laws. The fact that they don't is actually really, that's telling. It really shows that it's reflecting a world that's different from the reality of the author, right? And similarly, the fact that the Tanakh constantly seems to almost savor writing about the flaws of our founders and heroes, it's incredible, actually, right? Nobody did that. Even today, there's quite a lot of spin doctors in every arena. Well, the fact that Tanakh will condemn our founders, King David, who's the most beloved figure, and so many others, very severely, you can see that the message isn't political or self-serving. It's quite the opposite. It's everybody is answerable to God, and we all have a relationship with God, and let's engage in that relationship. So, two books today that are full-length studies. If you want to really go for it with this, if you haven't already read them, it's called. One, Rabbi Amnon, Bazakin, the other one is Professor, this just came out, Berman, Amin, and some subtitle, I don't remember what that is offhand. These are both great book-length studies. I think they're the two best book-length studies written by people who know tradition very well and who know the academy very well, and take on many more issues than we're going to take on today, but I think that they're very, very worthwhile. Rabbi Amnon Bazakin, in his book, addresses the flaw of viewing Tanakh as self-serving for the groups that wrote it, as opposed to a God document that teaches all of us how to behave. One of them is, the critics would say that the priests wrote the laws of the Torah because they wanted to justify the priesthood and gain all of these gifts. It sounds reasonable. I know plenty of self-serving people, so do you. They might pretend to be more altruistic, but they're not. Okay, the downside of that theory, as Rabbi Bazak points out, is that if the priests are writing this to self-benefit, why in the world don't they give themselves land? The Kohanim are entirely dependent on society and the farmers just to eat. If it were a self-serving crew of priests, they would be the highest paid people in the country living on the choicest pieces of land, but they had no land, right? Or the book of Deuteronomy was written to justify the kingship. So Rabbi Bazak says the Torah is the only set of laws in the ancient Near East that severely restrict the powers of the king. Everybody else, the king is either a deity or at least a lawgiver and has absolute powers. The fact that the only laws in the Torah about kingship restrict the king and very significantly in all the normal things that kings did seems to suggest that it's not just a self-serving monarchy document, but rather, no, even the king is answerable to God and the laws. And the fact that the prophets hold up everybody to scrutiny, even people like King David, says it all right there. I consider that the most honest passage of any literature ever written, taking the most beloved character in our history and accusing him of two of the greatest sins that any Israelite can, or any human being can commit, adultery and murder. That's very severe. These are not trivial little things. It's not a matter of teaching nobody's perfect, right? There are other characters who do things that are flawed but not evil. These are full-blown sins and really, really bad ones. The fact that the prophet in the narrative and the prophetic narrative both condemn King David very, very soundly and harshly, and there's no pretense of hiding this from the world, suggests that we're dealing with something that is very different from ancient Near Eastern literature, and that's trying to teach a certain series of values and morals. One last point, I'll turn it over to you, is the issue of contradictions. The Torah has many, many contradictions. This is not a new thing from modern critical scholarship. This is something that the rabbis were quite aware of. But the rabbis did something that left us vulnerable to what the critics did. What the rabbis did is they said, okay, we have a lot of contradictions, let's solve them. And we got really good at that. In fact, we're amazing. Read any page of the Talmud and you will see how good at this we are, right? We harmonize, we explain this verse is talking about A and that verse is talking about B. Those are our two top strategies. We're excellent at this, and we bat 1,000. We always manage to solve the problem. But what isn't dealt with on a systematic level ever until the 18th and 19th centuries by liberal Protestants is, okay, fine. So here are all of your harmonizations and explanations of the contradictions. But let me ask, why did God put so many contradictions in the Torah in the first place that we have to go interpreting everything? Just say it straight. So that was a really good question that we didn't really address because we just took for granted. Okay, God gave us the Torah. Here are the contradictions. Let's address them. But we never stopped to ask, well, why is the Torah like this, or other biblical books? Why are they like it? We just fixed the contradictions and moved on. So that left all faith communities vulnerable to the fact that the liberal Protestants thought of a response to this first, which was, okay, the reason why there are contradictions is because different authors wrote different parts of the Torah, and they had different opinions, or they represented different schools of thought or different laws. And we were left open with that. We really had no good response. So at that point, Rabbi David Zvi Hoffman, who lived in 19th century Germany, who was right in the thick of it all, so Hoffman believed that the best strategy is to go in there and try to show why these contradictions are not contradictions, solve everything. And then people will just believe that God revealed the Torah again, which, looking back on this 100 years seems rather naive, but I don't blame him at all. That was the best strategy available at that time. That's what he tried to do. And often enough, he was right. I mean, often enough, the so-called contradictions have long been discredited. But it doesn't take away the most basic issue, which is there still are very many. And there's still no explanation for why that should be so. It was left for the 1960s that Rabbi Mordechai Breuer finally stepped in the Orthodox world to address this question. Rabbi Breuer argued that the Torah does speak in different voices, and God revealed all of these voices. And the reason why it's written this way, not in a more straightforward manner that we may have expected, is because divine truth is unfathomable to us puny humans. And so what God did is he broke down laws and narratives into different sections. And each section must be understood on its own terms. Do not interpret in light of the other passages. And each thing is teaching lessons, laws, values, etc. And then the oral law and rabbinic tradition is required to tell us now either what happened historically, because you have to harmonize different historical accounts if you want to know what happened, or more importantly, what the law is. What do we do, or what do we not do? If there are contradictions in law, we can't function. So we need the oral law to work that out for us. But in the realm of pshat, the realm of trying to understand the plain sense of the text, that is not only is that not required, but it's a productive avenue of inquiry. So for the first time, somebody's coming along and saying, contradictions are a valuable learning tool rather than something that needs to be fixed. So whether or not his theory is persuasive, I don't think it is. But again, I'm Monday morning quarterback over 60 years after he published these articles. That's not relevant. What matters is he changed the game in the Orthodox world to suddenly realize, you know what? We can address contradictions much more productively than simply fixing them. So that's what we owe to him. And I think we've made huge strides in that reality as well. Okay. I'm going to pause here and turn it over to you. So I think that we have this 1 hour together. Let's make the most of it. And I mean, I can wrap it up at the end, but if there are specific questions about anything I've said or things that are just on your mind, I think that this is a great time to go for it. Take it away.
Okay, I'll start if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
In the literature, why is Deuteronomy always singled out as Chumash? This is the one book that is maybe everything else is in one period, but Deuteronomy is always kind of put on its own pedestal. Like, this has to be from a later time, or it's I'm talking more source criticism here.
Understood.
So my question is it from the content of the book itself, or is it more from something more tangible, like say grammatical differences or different verb choices, synonyms, things like that?
Very good. Yeah. So it's a multiplicity of issues. Deuteronomy at least is much more internally coherent and consistent than other books in this way, in terms of linguistics, in terms of word choices, in terms of favored terminologies. It's not nearly as foolproof as that last sentence just was, but it's enough that triggered scholars to think that Deuteronomy stands as its own work that's different somehow, not to mention very often there are contradictions between Deuteronomy and earlier books, whether in law or in narrative, because there are. So the question is, what do you do about that? So source criticism came up with, the first just establishing what I just said. And again, there are serious holes, like big, but for that requires a full-blown, like you could read the 2 books that I posted up there, and there are other works also that deal with more individual argumentation. And then finally came the argument of, I can tell you when Deuteronomy was written, because in the time of Josiah in the 7th century BCE, they found a Torah. And even some traditional sources think that the Torah that was found was the book of Deuteronomy. And so that became, okay, they didn't find it, they wrote it. As opposed to they found it locked up or hidden somewhere because Josiah's grandfather Menashe was the notorious king who really brought idolatry as the national policy, and so it might have been a good time to hide the Torah or whatever reason. But whatever, be that as it may, that flimsy link became the cornerstone of the documentary hypothesis. So again, you can't scientifically disprove that whole line, but you can certainly challenge it in a very meaningful way. But that was the origin of that in a nutshell.
Okay, got it. Regarding more in line with the documentary hypothesis, which has been, ever since Wellhausen, came on the scene, that's kind of been a big part of the, academic discourse on biblical criticism. It's my understanding that nowadays, you can tell me if I'm completely off base on here, but nowadays it's hard to justify a lazy redactor, simply because with a lot of scholarship, the complexity in the Chumash is much more apparent. So you can't really justify, okay, well, this is just kind of one piece over here. Let's just kind of get staple it in here and going on. Is that kind of where the state of scholarship is? Like, maybe accepting that there is source criticism, but the final form is kind of like, okay, this is ideologically, and maybe not ideologically, but at least as a document, one furnace whole. You can't really. It's hard to quote unquote darshan out where the sources are. Does that make sense?
The language that I've seen used in places is it's hard to unscramble the omelet into its component eggs, right? And right now you have this omelet, okay, so it's one unified whole, regardless of how it came to be, but there's no way you can pull out the different layers anyway. The state of scholarship today is very fragmented. It's not one thing anymore. When Rabbi Breuer was writing in 1960 or so, the academic consensus was documentary hypothesis. There may have been some oddballs out there who thought otherwise. That was the regnant hypothesis throughout European universities here in America and in the Israeli Academy also, albeit with some nuance over there. But by and large, that was the way to go. Whereas now there are different schools, and nobody's going to go back to God revealed the entire Torah in its complex form to Moses. That you're not going to hear that in the academy very often. But you will definitely hear radically different conceptions of how the Torah may have come to be. I agree that the redactor, treating him as a lazy redactor who just slaps things together, is very, very difficult. And literary study of the Bible in purely academic circles has challenged that without trying to challenge it, just by pointing out, wow, you could read narratives as incredibly not uniform, but unified, and that they interact and are in dialogue with other biblical texts, which is very different from saying that they're just random sources that didn't know about each other that were then thrown together. I think that there's certainly a much more meaningful encounter, even within many academic circles, than there was when Rabbi Breuer was fighting the faith science battle back in the day. It's simply not a faith science battle anymore.
I see. Go ahead, David, or Rhonda.
Take it away.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask on the point of ideological myths, do we have any knowledge as far as, almost ironically, like what the origin is of ideology? Like, what is there a history to it? That were those even really constructs that existed before like the post-Enlightenment era, and maybe we're just kind of superimposing it on or now we.
That's a great question. I do not know. I don't know the history of how far back that was, at least an understanding. The reason why it makes intuitive sense, again, I live after Hermann Gunkel, is that there are stories in the Torah and certainly other cultures also, where explicitly here's why A or B. That at least gives you a sense of, okay, there's an opening to that kind of conversation that goes back to these ancient sources, but you're right. Whether or not this was therefore what it was, I have no idea. I don't know how far back that scholarship goes.
And I might even, I guess, clarify my question on Lower Angel. I feel like you kind of touched on it, that maybe probably a better way of me asking it is not just ideology, but almost pure ideology, where I'm thinking like in the sense of history, of not just having history wrapped up in a story where there's history and theology and literature and kind of everything bundled together, but these clear distinctions and categorizations of ideology as opposed to something else.
I totally understand. No, I understand what you're saying. In general, I mean, all forms of Western analysis do that. Like you create these nice, neat categories, as opposed to thinking maybe it's just a lot of different things rolled into one. If that's what you're asking, like the idea that this really was just an ideological myth and nothing else. Right? That seems like a weird thing to suggest for any of these stories, like to say that there was no purpose other than, right? So I agree with you. I think in general, Professor Berman's book in general takes on certain radical misunderstandings of Western universities just based on assumptions. Because even with our conception of law, like, common law versus statutory law. So in the good old days, common law just means, okay, judges have precedents and they have their oral traditions, and they use precedents not as the binding what we're going to do every time, but to inform our decisions that we'll make in the courts. Whereas statutory law is, no, here's a code, here's the law, this is the applied law, and there's no other applied law in this land. So the critics who were asking questions about contradiction in law in the Torah assumed the Torah is a statutory law code. Whereas it's most certainly not, and it never was. It's Torah Sheba'al Peh, the whole idea of oral law presumes that this is not the absolute law that all courts must follow. And in fact, rabbinic law would say as emphatically as possible, certain laws as written never were applied as such in courts, right? Because we have the oral law that really governed how we live, and that goes very, very far back as well. So that's another good example of a very late conception of literature, or in this case of law, that is so painfully anachronistic. It's just the wrong tool to use when exploring an ancient text. So Professor Berman, you should read, I don't think he deals with your ideological myth question, although he might, I don't remember, but I don't think he does. He is much more just dealing with the fact that you can't understand the Torah's conventions by imposing 19th or 20th century rules onto it. It has much more to do with, let's understand ancient analogies, and that gives you a much clearer picture of what the Torah might be doing also. So the answer is, the short form of that is, I don't know the answer to your question. Just make sure that that gets across clear also. So I don't know, but somebody may, and at least somebody would know more about the scholarship of where this idea comes into play. But I just remember being very thunderstruck by why is it either or? I don't care if the Tower of Babel has a, this is why there's French at the end of the story. That's fine, right? But to say that that's the only value that the original story came to convey, I think is bizarre. Mm-hmm. It's clearly trying to open up worlds that's far more powerful and far more important than the why there are many languages question.
You mentioned a few books to follow up and read on. Can you recommend any other, if we want to delve a little deeper, like academic journals where most of these things are getting published, even if they're not on English?
It's a good thing to read if you want to just go for it with the history of everything. It's called HBOT, which is Hebrew Bible / Old Testament. By, it's Magne Sabo. I don't remember how to spell it, but I have it on my shelf. It's definitely M. I don't remember the whole name offhand. I'm sure you can find this on. I think it's spelled like this or something along those lines. Mine are green. So it's basically, it's a 5-volume, it's like an encyclopedic work that tries to trace the history of Bible interpretation, starting with interbiblical, midrash, the classic medieval Jewish commentaries, Christian commentaries, Karaites, all the way down to, and the last volumes are much more about modern scholarship. They're excellent overview essays by leading scholars in the respective field, and it's a wide array of scholars that write in this encyclopedic work. trying to just map out, the documentary hypothesis and its origins, contemporary schools, at least as of a few years ago when the last volumes came out. So I think that if you really want to go for it, that's, I think, a really good start, and it's a starting point. And then each article has a gazillion references that you can then pursue if you want to really go for it. So that's just an academic work, but I found it very enlightening to me, because I know my good rabbis better, although I learned a lot about them too. But it was important for me to hear more about the history of Christian interpretation and Karaite scholarship and academic, just where it all really emerged from and what the different schools are. So nowadays, again, it's much more fragmented than it was 70 years ago. And I think it would have been a different conversation, or it would have just been like, at that point, I wouldn't have understood Rabbi Breuer. Rabbi Breuer wrote very cryptically at the beginning, and the whole Orthodox establishment attacked him. But a lot of it was rooted in the fact that he was not clear. He was writing very mystically and poetically in an almost incomprehensible way. And it took a bunch of years for him to start writing in a way that regular folk like me could understand, which is because I wasn't born when he was writing the original articles. But at least by the time I came on and was interested in reading these things, you could read him and understand his later works. There's a collection of essays on him, by the way, somewhere by Yosef Ofer in Hebrew, just on Rabbi Breuer and his theory of aspects. I don't remember the exact name. The whole book is in Hebrew. That also is very worthwhile, just his original essays and essays about him and various back and forth, just important works that were written about him that give you an excellent overview as to A, what he contributed, and then B, what his weaknesses are. And Rabbi Bazakin certainly touches upon him and his work and the aftermath in his book as well.
If I could, I guess it's a slight shift, more like Inyan Dioma, as far as Purim and the, I guess, academic conversation and debates that go with Megillat Esther. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, specifically the claim that, which I've seen that that Esther is would fall under the category of a historical novel, and really anything you have on that topic.
I mean, again, there's nothing scientific that you could prove one way or the other. Mm-hmm. And you might note that certain elements of the Megillah that we have are not attested in parallel ancient histories like Herodotus and so on. That's definitely true. But I don't know why I would give one more credibility than another. Herodotus also is famous, A, for hating Persia and B, for lying a lot. So that doesn't mean that everything that he says is wrong. He's certainly an important witness to that period, and so I don't read him. I've never read his works cover to cover, but I like reading when scholars quote him, just to get a sense of, okay, here's a non-Jewish writer who's out of our fray writing about the Persians, however biased he might have been. So I never take sides on what would scholarship tell you, because scholarship can't prove or disprove that the story happened. Right? It's much more about, I believe that the story, at least in its fundamentals, happened on some level, that the Jewish people were threatened in some way or another. And I read it as an event that occurred, just as I would read anything in Tanakh. But the way that I do it, I'm giving a class for a London group tomorrow, plus Zoom. I don't have to go to England every single time I give a class for them. I like England, but I don't want to go there every single time I give a class for them. And so it's on how literally must we take Tanakh in general. That's what tomorrow's talk is about. And the premise is, I read Tanakh as a fundamentalist, but think like a maximalist, meaning I don't gain much from the struggle, did this particular detail happen or not, because that doesn't help me in my learning. I'm much more interested in, here's the story as it is told, or try to figure out how it is told, and what am I supposed to learn from that story? And I interact with it as though the story happened as is. If there are historical challenges to this or that, that's fine. That's the maximalist, right? If you think like a maximalist, where Sadi Gaon and Rambam, meaning it never should be that there's a real faith-science conflict. So if somebody could show a genuine faith-science conflict in these areas, okay, that's fine. That in no way changes my understanding of the lesson that we're supposed to go. Since I have my sister Rhonda on the horn, her husband is a very prominent geneticist. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, not to mention a wonderful man, husband, and father, and brother-in-law for me. So every now and then when we discuss things that affect my biblical world, which I at least want to know, you're a real scientist, help me here. And so one of the things that comes up, which is a very obvious point, you don't need to be a trained geneticist to know this, is that it's really, scientists is supposedly never supposed to say the word impossible, but it's rather remote based on whatever we know about genetics that all the different DNA strands in the world today emerged from one couple that lived ballpark 6,000 years ago. Right? That's a very difficult claim to make scientifically. So I'm like, all right, so be it. So I'm still not going to become a racist. In other words, the Torah's goal of teaching that we're all from one family is that all humanity should view itself as one family. That is a religious axiom. No people is any superior to anybody else. No people is inferior to anybody else. We're all created in God's image. That's what I care about in that sentence. Whether or not that's genetically the reality is irrelevant to how I perceive the story. But in other words, in order to do that, I read it as though, okay, we're really all descendants of Adam and Eve, and all humanity is one family. And if, by the way, scientifically that is not so, okay, so scientifically that is not so. But the message that the Torah is laying out is the noblest message of all human history, and that we need to pursue it. So Megillat Esther doesn't have the same oomph as all humanity created in God's image, I don't think. But in terms of Jewish identity and the observance of Purim, I celebrate it with, I have a son named Mordechai, who's named after my father, who's also Mordechai. And yeah, I believe that was a real guy once upon a time in the Persian Empire who was a very prominent Jew who really helped the Jewish people in a very meaningful way, along with his cousin Esther, right? I believe that. If somehow you could show me that no way that this is possible, okay, that would in no way change my Purim, nor all the lessons that I think we learn from the Megillah. But I don't expect that anybody will ever be able to disprove the whole story in its fabric. So as usual, I don't know, nor am I trying to prove or disprove. It's more about, it's an approach. And that's what I try to teach. I try to teach an approach, because I don't think historians one way or the other will solve these questions. If they did, we have to deal with that. And then we would simply adjust our lens accordingly. Like I think with the DNA thing, you actually could adjust your lens accordingly, and that's fine. Here, I don't think anybody will. It's a matter of your perception of how you read the story as a genre, and then how much historical reality needs to underlie that. But feel free to follow up. I mean, to me, it's more of an approach. It's not, so it's not a dogmatic, yeah, it all happened word for word as it is, although it certainly could have, yeah.
Yeah. So I would even, I guess, follow up, not even necessarily from your perspective individually, but looking at Sefer Eov, that a very, very legitimate opinion is to say that it didn't, there wasn't necessarily an individual named Eov. From my understanding, that is like a very legitimate opinion within our tradition. I'm glad to at least know that I have one thing that I, but to take, I guess, a somewhat similar approach and say, look, it's not in kind of the general area where we even look for quote unquote history. It's not Chumash. It's not in Nevi'im. So do you think that if one were to take that approach, that would be like michutz lamachana, or do you think no, that would at least be like a legitimate approach to take, that it's loosely historical or not, or maybe just kind of characterizes a certain era or a certain situation, but the individuals weren't necessarily in existence, or if they weren't really those areas of power?
So it's a great question. It's one that I actually think about a lot in terms of how far one could pursue the principle, given that you have Book of Eov as a banner example. I think in my talk tomorrow, I'll mention it at the end. But at least in my mind, there is a distinction between the Book of Eov, which plays no role in either our identity or, more importantly in this case, our observance. Now, if you go through a Pesach Seder and say our ancestors were slaves in Egypt and God redeemed us, for that sentence to be entirely not true historically, and then to go through all of these observances and to constantly remember these events as foundational events in our history that occurred, at some point you have to at least ask yourself, are you living a lie? I don't mean you, I mean one who says, look, we can still learn the lessons that are necessary, but none of this happened at all. The question is, are you now living a lie? Or if we say Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, just your they're our ancestors, whether physically, biologically, or because somebody at some point in their family history converted in. So now they're part of the family in the same way. Okay, but to say that these people didn't exist at all, and say that we are a genetic nation, it's not just an ideology, a genetic biological nation that comes from people that never really existed, I feel like that's already, I'm not trying to define the parameters of faith here. I'm just saying that seems to be counterintuitive to living an honest religious life, right? And not that all the details of each story must have happened exactly as is, but rather just that the basic fundamental kernel contains some actual historical truth. Whereas the book of Iyov has no impact on our identity in that way. It's really the theology that drives the story. That's why Rambam has no trouble at all saying Rambam following that Talmudic opinion has no trouble saying that this story didn't happen. But even, whether it says at the end, whether it happened or not, that's not what this book is about. I don't think he would say that about the book of Exodus. He certainly believes that Abraham was a very real character and a great philosopher at that. So you can dispute the Rambam style philosopher that he turns Abraham into, but Rambam certainly believes that was a flesh and blood human being, and Rambam believes that he is a descendant of that human being. Right? So I think that's a better way, I think, of thinking about it. There is at least some historical kernel. I think Professor Joshua Berman in his book tries to address that also. He's not trying to prove that every last detail of the Torah happened, because you can't prove every last detail happened from external sources, but to say that there's some kernel of historical truth underlying the narrative I think it's a realistic expectation from within tradition, given how we live our lives. All right. So I happen to love that question, because I think about it oftentimes just in terms of where the boundaries should be. So I'm not a boundary definer. I prefer to just approach things and then to go about things my way, which is read fundamentalist and think maximalist. But the question is, I'm aware of observant Jews who believe along the lines of what you were describing before, and they really keep all the mitzvot. We can eat in each other's homes, keep Shabbat together, all those things. But they simply don't believe that these characters existed or that these events happened in the least. So I have my troubled issues with that, just because I feel like, again, too much of our lives rely on at least some basic historicity to that line, even if you don't have to have every detail required for that. So to summarize the whole thing, the whole point of this, and with this will close, it's 2:01, so I start on time, end on time type of guy. Scholarship is a friend. I don't think there's any downside to scholarship. I think one of the things that traditionalists and non-traditionalists need to think about is the distinction between scholarship and scholars of every stripe. Scholars are all biased, whether they're religious, atheists, Jewish, Christian, Karaite, agnostic, or somewhere in the middle. Everybody's got biases based on personal preferences, based on educational, based on the values of a society. There's no way around that. Nobody can be objectively fair in the fullest sense. But scholarship as a method is something that our classical commentaries have always pursued with an agenda. They want to know what is God's word. So to me, whenever scholarship has something that is true, or even just a good challenge, I find it 100% of the time valuable. I don't think there's any downside to scholarship. The hazard that we have to deal with, and not just we, every generation deals with, is that because nobody is objective, very often subjective claims of scholars who don't share our beliefs present their opinions as fact or as true, and very often believing Jews, I'm sure this is true in the Christian community as well, but I'm more familiar with the Jewish side of things, find that their faith threatened because of, oh my goodness, how can I bury my head in the sand? Whereas my attitude is, you never ever need to bury your head in the sand. There certainly are endless approaches, which they're not always compatible with tradition, but they certainly are methods of encountering challenging questions that are simply enlightening. I find it all worthwhile in that sense. So that's just a nutshell version of everything. I gave you a few books to read for your further edification, and always please feel free to email me. There's no source sheet in this particular talk, so I can give you. If you ever want to follow up on any of this or anything else, please do feel free to reach out. I wish everybody a wonderful Purim based on a story that really happened, and a great ongoing thing. And I look forward to having more classes in the future with you. So thank you so much, and all the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good luck defending your dissertation.
Thank you.